Hello again and welcome to Spotlight, the interview show on RT. I'm Al Gurnov, and today my guest is Viktor Gerashchenko. Exactly 20 years ago today, the collapse of the Soviet superpower pushed the whole world into a new era. Many experts say the crash was inevitable as the country faced a severe economic crisis in the late 80s. But others think the situation was not that bad and the downturn was even masterminded by the foes of the USSR. Where's the truth? Was the Soviet Union a mere victim of an economic downturn, and could it be saved? In 1991, we in Russia believed that the one behind all that was Gorbachev. Now, we suspect that money, dollars and rubles mattered more than political will. So, here's the former chairman of the Soviet Central Bank and still one of the most renowned bankers in Russia, Viktor Gerashchenko.
By the beginning of the 80s, the Soviet economy had been suffering a long-lasting stagnation. It was greatly stressed by the arms race and oil crisis, which caused a sharp fall in Moscow's foreign currency earnings. Mikhail Gorbachev's perestroika reform was designed to set things right by commercializing and liberalizing the economy. But these reforms didn't help, and the hardliners' plot against the reformers, known as the August Coup, eventually led to the collapse of the Soviet Union.
Hello, Mr. Gerashchenko. Welcome to the show.
Hello.
First of all, let us talk about the collapse of the Soviet Union. You were the head of the state bank when the Soviet Union disintegrated. To you, was it as much of a surprise as it was for 90% of the Russian people?
I came to the State Bank in 1989. Prior to that, I worked my entire life at Vneshtorgbank, foreign trade bank, where I often interacted with Western businesses. So I realized that we were moving towards a dead end. Besides, since my college years, I'd been friends with Valentin Pavlov, who was the head of the pricing committee, and later finance minister, and later got involved in the 1991 coup. So I picked up a lot of information from my conversations with him. In fact, there were serious reforms in the works in the Soviet government. They included three key aspects. First, a pricing reform, because pricing had been wrong ever since industrialization.
I see.
Then there was only government property and collective property. You know, there were a few workshops in collective property producing consumer goods, like clothes, for example, and some apartment blocks were collective property too. And third, we had no taxes. The only tax we had was the income tax.
There was also the tax on childlessness.
Yes, childless people were frowned on then as they are now. Other than that, companies simply handed over all their revenues to the government, and the governments then distributed this money among recipients. By the way, quite often up to 4 different versions of the budget were prepared because nobody knew which industry will be given priority next year. Anyway, all that was supposed to be reformed. But since political events were following a different scenario, I mean the conflict between those two people.
You mean Yeltsin and Gorbachev?
Yes, because of that, everything went haywire.
Well, let's take a look at how the USSR disintegrated 20 years ago. Spotlight's Elena Demidova has the story.
The liberalization of society Mikhail Gorbachev initiated in the USSR in the late 1980s led to growing ethnic self-awareness in the country's republics and the rise of nationalist movements calling for independence. The feeling grew stronger as the world watched communist regimes overthrown one by one all across Eastern Europe in 1989. The revolutions climaxed in the fall of the Berlin Wall in 1990, which was a powerful premonition of changes awaiting the largest socialist state. In March 1991, a referendum was held in the USSR, which showed a majority of Soviet citizens wanted to retain the Union. However, the voting was boycotted by the Baltic republics, which were first to declare independence. Their example inspired other republics to break away. Fearing the disintegration of the USSR, authoritarian forces within the country tried to oust Gorbachev. The attempt at a coup was stopped by Boris Yeltsin, who, however, did not stop the dissolution of the country. On the 22nd of December 1991, Yeltsin and the presidents of the then Soviet republics of Ukraine and Belarus met secretly and agreed to dissolve the Soviet Union.
Mr. Gerashenko, you've mentioned the two people we just saw, Yeltsin and Gorbachev. Many think that it was the power struggle between those two major political figures that caused the collapse of the Soviet Union. However, people claiming to have a deeper understanding of the process say that the root cause was different. Of course, some also say that the collapse was orchestrated by the United States, but the key reason, some people believe, was money. Basically, they say the country died economy-wise. Do you agree with that?
You know, I can't agree with that. Let me give you a simple example from our time. America's foreign debt in dollars and mainly in treasury bonds, of course because they don't print actual bills, exceeds its GDP. They are only surviving on credit. The USSR had a budget deficit since around 1966, but that deficit was not properly reported to the Supreme Council, so no measures were taken. At the same time, lots of money was going towards armaments and rearmaments, so the deficit was not allowed to exceed the growth of people's savings deposits in Sberbank. From 1922, the time of the new economic policy, the State Bank and the Ministry of Finance kept tally of people's savings in the banks, even with the little salaries. They knew for how long an average person had to save up to be able to buy a new coat for his wife, with or without a fur collar.
Let alone a car or an apartment, people spend their entire lives saving money.
People knew how to count money. Besides, the people who were involved in economics had been taught before the war by old school professors. They understood inflation and other economic factors. These things were easy to coordinate back then with strict regulation over prices for everyday goods and pensions. That was the reason our economic model was somewhat artificial.
You said the Soviet Union lived on credit. Indeed, this was the case, especially in the 1990s, when the country subsisted on loans alone. The US has a huge foreign debt today, so why are the communists telling us that it's wrong? They're saying the Soviet system was right, and what we have today is wrong, but it seems like the system is the same.
Initially, most of our loans were only for 6 months. That's when I graduated and started working, but by the mid-60s, we were taking out medium-term credits to buy pipes and other equipment we needed to build oil and gas pipelines. My point is, say what you will about planned economy, but we knew how to plan our spending. These things were very strictly monitored.
You mentioned Valentin Pavlov, your friend who went on to become finance minister. His government administered a few unpopular reforms in 1991. People's savings suddenly went bust, some ruble bills were taken out of circulation, etc. It was all very serious. Do you think these measures helped? Was there any point to these reforms?
The point was partly to prepare people for changes. They had to realize that they couldn't just do nothing and expect manna from heaven. Pavlov realized that a price reform would in turn bring reforms of wages and pensions. That's why he thought that we might need a monetary reform as well. That's why he decided to replace 50 and 100 ruble bills in 1991. Mind you, that was not a monetary reform. The purpose was to battle counterfeit money. There were a lot of counterfeit bills in circulation because the governments allowed people to bring copy machines into the country without proper control. The idea was to allow a short period of time when people had to exchange all the 50 and 100 ruble bills they had, and those who had too much money would have to explain where they got it.
Before Gorbachev's time, despite some problems, the Soviet economy was producing a huge amount of goods. After Gorbachev came to power, the shelves suddenly turned empty. I remember walking into a store and seeing nothing but empty shelves. What happened? Where did all the goods go?
Do you know about the telegram that Finance Minister Orlov and myself, as the State Bank chairman, sent on the 19th of August? We did it because Pavlov told us to do it. It was asking Republic's agencies not to delay their payments to the Union government because Russia was holding on to its money. Russia set up its own central bank, even though it's unthinkable to have two central banks working in the same country with the same currency. So Russia was delaying its payments.
But you were still working in the State Bank.
I was in the State Bank of the Soviet Union, as it was called. That was when we sent the telegram saying that all money should be transferred to the Union government as soon as possible. In fact, that's why they fired me afterwards, because they said I supported the coup.
And the reason Russia was holding on to its money was because of Yeltsin's standoff with Gorbachev.
Yes, and he was trying to evade the agreements that we had concerning the budgets of Russia and that of the Soviet Union for 1991. That's why the government often didn't have the money, even to buy currency. Instead, we had to borrow money abroad. So, this was a real problem. But I don't agree that everything disappeared from the stores and then magically came back. Things don't happen this way. We have to keep in mind that the West was not very eager to lend to Russia in 1991 and 1992. So where did we have to take money from?
Says Viktor Gerashchenko, the former head of the Soviet Central Bank and one of the most renowned bankers and economists in Russia today. Spotlight will be back shortly after a break, so stay with us, don't go. We'll be back in less than a minute.
Wealthy British scion Zach Wilson, investment activist
Markets, finance, scandal. Find out what's really happening to the global economy with Max Kaiser. For a no-holds-barred look at the global financial headlines, tune in to Kaiser Report on RT.
Let the bodies hit the floor. Let the bodies hit the floor. Let the bodies hit the...
It's all designed to keep you closed in your own small world as a prisoner.
You know, you leave somebody in there for a couple hours like that in a stress position.
You have this fear of the unknown and this stress sort of building and building.
I've seen interrogations go on 10, 12 hours.
They chose songs, I remember, from Marilyn Manson and Metallica and
Slayer. The two songs would be Angel of Death and Raining Blood.
We were killing the enemy, going through war, coming up here into Iraq, coming into Baghdad. Johnny Poole, let the bodies hit the floor.
We're just a rock and roll band.
It was fitting for the job we were doing.
Let the bodies hit the floor. Let the bodies hit the floor. Let the bodies hit the
Welcome back to Spotlight. I'm Al Gurnov, and just a reminder that my guest on the show today is Viktor Gerashchenko, the former head of the Soviet Central Bank, one of the most renowned economists and bankers in Russia today.
Mr. Gerashchenko, I would like to ask you the following question once again. Even with the standoff between Yeltsin and Gorbachev, even with the growing economic hardships that the USSR was facing and that contributed much to its breakup, can we still say that it was to a large extent, if not fully, due to to the efforts of the West that the process of disintegration gained momentum in the Soviet Union, that the West manipulated oil prices and did all they could to encourage these developments in the USSR?
Well, first of all, we should say that the Soviet Union's economy was quite worn down, even its defense industry. We say the defense industry is big in the West, but we also had it in the USSR. One of my relatives, my younger sister's husband, worked in the foreign ministry and participated in the very early disarmament talks. And he used to say, we just can't give the Americans any sensible explanation as to why the heck we have produced so many SS-20 missiles. There were enough of them to blow up 3 planets like the Earth. Why should we want 3 times the amount? That means that our defense industry kept ordering more and more and more. They requested upgrades and new developments, and this was destroying the economy. On the other hand, the defense industry itself required upgrading, new weapons and so on. Another thing to say is that in those times, as far as I know, there was not a single Western-made piece of equipment in the USSR. Some Western equipment was purchased for the plants of the Ministry of Machine Building, which produced equipment for the defense industry. That's how it was, much like with China now.
I recall that the West wasn't particularly eager to sell us any equipment. I remember a story when the Soviet Union was trying to buy some double-purpose piece of equipment, which led to a scandal, and we were accused of trying to steal some military secrets.
Right. There were so many things, the nuclear project. But it should be admitted that partially we ourselves contributed to the destructive processes by getting involved in the arms race, although ironically the signing of the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty was expedited by the hydrogen bomb test.
Nikolai Ryzhkov, former head of the Soviet cabinet, said in 2010 that the shortage of retail products during Gorbachev's rule was actually encouraged and facilitated by some political leaders in Russia. Among other things, he alleged that Yeltsin approved a major reconstruction project to start simultaneously at 24 tobacco factories in order to create a shortage of tobacco products in the country and use it to incite growing public resentment of the authorities, since the people were sensitive to a shortage in cigarettes.
It's possible, although I should say I wasn't aware of all the details of the economic situation. But I can say for sure that the budget was severely hit by the government's decision to increase the price on vodka and restrict the number of items one customer was allowed to purchase.
If the government introduced state monopoly over vodka sales today, would that do any good to Russia's economy?
I think that we could at least try and reintroduce the order that existed in Russia before the 1917 revolution. In those times there was a nickname for entrepreneurs selling vodka, the kissers.
I recall that name.
And it came from the tradition for such businessmen to swear an oath to the Tsar and seal it with a kiss on the cross, the oath being that they promise to pay the value-added tax to the state in good faith. That's what we can do. It doesn't matter which plant produces vodka. It's also known that in the old times, farmers didn't drink every day. They only had vodka for holidays.
And in winter?
In the winter time, and when the farming season is over. They would also make their own spirits too, because they could not afford the vodka sold at the store.
Going back to the fall of the Soviet Union, you've mentioned Valentin Pavlov, who joined the emergency committee which staged a coup in August 1991. Many prominent and respected people in the Soviet Union joined that coup. The feature story we just saw said that the coup was an attempt to preserve the Soviet Union, to counteract the Novo-Ogarevo negotiations started by Gorbachev. Would you agree with that?
They wanted to introduce a state of emergency which could save the Soviet Union. What is interesting is that head of Kazakhstan, Nazarbayev, never reached Belovezhskaya Pushcha. He was invited, but he must have decided not to go there just in case.
An Asian politician is supposed to be sly.
When television covered the 1991 events, they interviewed a man by the name of Kravchenko. He was the chairman of the Committee on Television and Radio. Kravchenko was dismissed shortly after 1991, but he said that the draft decree to introduce an economic state of emergency had been shown to Gorbachev when it was being written in April 1991. The document had Gorbachev's comments on it, so it's not true that Gorbachev knew nothing about these plans. He knew about them. He might not have liked them, but he could see that the country was heading towards economic problems because of his conflicts with Yeltsin and his team.
It seems like Gorbachev is still holding on to the idea that he could have renewed the USSR, somehow given it a new lease of life if he had been given the opportunity. Do you believe in that?
Maybe, but generally I have always thought of him as somewhat quixotic. Gorbachev often told us that the one-party system was hampering the Soviet Union. He said we had 17 million communists, only a fraction of whom were truly committed to the cause. So we had to do something about it. But with all the things he said and the things I listened to because I was invited to these meetings by protocol, I still think Gorbachev lacked decisiveness. His idea was to create a second party similar to the Labour Party, or on the basis of labour unions, or some other organization to encourage competition in the parliament. But he never got around to making any actual steps towards this. I think the conflict started when he dismissed Grishin and appointed Yeltsin, although Yeltsin was hardly fit for the position, since Yekaterinburg is very different from Moscow.
Let us be frank. Putin and Medvedev are also unhappy about the single-party system. They're trying to change it, but no matter what they do, they end up with a model communist party on their hands. Do you agree?
It is true. You know, it might be in our genes. First we had the Rurikids, then Ivan the Terrible's reforms and atrocities disrupted the system.
Then the Romanovs came along.
Yes, the Romanov dynasty. They were not even the best candidates, they just had the Patriarch as an uncle. So they started ruling the country. I think every regime degrades over time. Regimes need to be replaced, but it should be done constitutionally. People are right today when they say we should have not a majority in parliaments that can turn down any outside initiative.
When Soviet republics, including the second largest of them, Ukraine, started declaring sovereignty one after another, I remember that very distinct feeling that was in the air on both sides. We were saying, let them go, we're only feeding them anyway. They thought they would become immensely rich after they secede. For some reason, this did not happen. Were the politicians advocating secession in these states lying to their people?
The problem is that some politicians in the party did not have a clear idea of the economy is. That was actually the reason why Nazarbayev and Karimov did better than the rest of them. Nazarbayev ran a steel mill, then went on to become a minister, then the prime minister. Karimov worked at his Republic's finance ministry. They had a better understanding of their own economies and their problems. Now, let us take a look at the Soviet Union's budget. When we were discussing the possibility of uniting with Belarus, people told us, why would we want to feed Belarus? I told them, take a look at the last few budgets of the Soviet Union and you will see that the only two republics were self-sufficient economically, Russia and Belarus. Even Ukraine got subsidies from the Union budget, as the military and defense industry was too large. It was huge. In fact, I thought Ukraine would do best after the Union collapsed. That was my opinion, but I was wrong.
Ukraine cut down its defense budget, but I would not say their life has become better. We stopped funding them, and our life did not get better. Why is that?
They're even buying food from Belarus.
We all thought we would end up with a better economic situation, but it didn't happen. Why is that? Miracles don't happen?
You know, we like to believe in fairy tales. We have plenty of them. Something of that sort happened in the Baltic states. They never left the Union, you know. They asked for permission to conduct an economic experiment, to conduct their own economic policy. The USSR Supreme Council was against it, but Gorbachev came in and convinced them to let the Baltic states have a try.
When the Soviet Union collapsed, you changed your position from head of the USSR Central Bank to head of Russia's Central Bank.
No, I first spent some time working for Stanislav Shatalin's foundation. But when they could not balance the central bank's budget for 1991, and the deputies, Gaidar in particular, were a little angry with the previous head, they dismissed him and hired us, although he was by no means a stupid man.
They needed someone who could do math.
I said I would only come if they allowed me to bring my team along.
When I spoke to Mr. Gaidar or people from his team, they would always claim that Russia only had enough food to last for 2 days when they came to power. They claim they saved Russia from famine. Is it true?
I was not the Minister for Food, but I think it is a lie.
So it is not true that the country was on the brink of starvation.
The USSR would spend $100 million worth of foreign consumer commodities. They would be distributed between major cities. We did not buy enough, and that was why people would look for underwear from Germany or shoes from Czechoslovakia. We simply did not allocate enough money for it.
Russia went through a phase of so-called barbaric capitalism after the Soviet Union fell apart. Was there ever an alternative to that? Could the transition have been made smoother?
Do you remember former Polish President Lech Wałęsa?
Of course.
The head of the Solidarity trade union. He had a good economic advisor, Balcerowicz, and although he went down the liberal path too, it worked for Poland, but Poland was very different from the Soviet Union. It's an undivided country with a single religion.
In fact, Mr. Balcerowicz was a guest on one of our shows.
Mr. Wałęsa once said that he had never thought a transition from a pro-socialist system, which Poland had at the time, even with its free agriculture and trade, that this transition to the market economy would be such a painful process. He said it was the same as trying to make a good fish soup with fish from your fish tank. I could not put it better myself.
Thank you very much for being with us, and just a reminder that my guest today was Viktor Gerashchenko, the former head of the Soviet Central Bank. And that's it for now from all of us here. Spotlight will be back with more. Until then, stay on RT and take care. Спасибо.